to you. Good morning, good morning, good morning. Won't you share with a friend or two? Good morning, good morning, good morning to you. Good morning, good morning, good morning to you. Good morning, good morning, good morning. Welcome to Daring Dialogues. I am your host, Shantae Charles. I hope that everybody is having a great and wonderful day. I hope that everybody's day is going well. I hope that you have gotten some sleep and some rest. I was not feeling well yesterday evening, so I made sure that I got plenty of sleep so that I could be better. And I'm feeling a little bit better this morning. Still not feeling 100% myself, but guess what? I'm alive. I'm in the land of the living. I'm in my right mind. I have a mind to serve God. I have a mind to praise God. I have a mind to be positive. I have a mind to be kind to other people. I could have woke up in a completely different frame of mind. So I am just thankful this morning. As the old people said, as the older people in my past, in my generations ahead of me always say, you could have woke up pushing up daisies. Could have woke up on the other side. But since you have not awakened on the other side, it is best to thank God for being awake on this side of the world, on this side of the spiritual terrains. So good morning to each and every one of you. Well, this is Relationship Wednesday. For those of you who are new here for the first time, we focus on all kinds of relationships on this broadcast. Again, we have talked about singleness in the past, and we're probably going to go back through that with some other reading material. We've covered marriage. We've covered engagement. We've covered dating and what dating actually is and the history behind dating. I encourage anybody who's like, dating is it, to go and look at those broadcasts. A lot of people don't realize that dating was initially tied to prostitution because they could not figure out how to differentiate dating from what prostitutes were doing. Just let that sink in. And so they actually had to legally codify the difference between dating and prostitution. So good morning, Priestley. So in this particular day, on this particular day of Daring Dialogues, we cover things that have to do with relationships. And right now we're talking about the relationship that we have with ourselves. Thank you, Lady Barbara. So if you want to check out the history of dating, I highly recommend a book called Labor of Love. Labor of Love. And she takes us through the history of dating as we know it here in the United States. So right now we are really dealing with ourselves in these segments. We're dealing with leadership principles in this particular season. We're dealing with, some of us have some narcissistic tendencies that we picked up. Doesn't mean that you have the official diagnosis of narcissism or anything like that. But you might have some tendencies that you have picked up and you have developed throughout your childhood. There were some things maybe we believed about ourselves that we began to internalize, and now those things are starting to affect the relationships around us. So that's what we're taking a look at today. We're reading from a book called Everyday Narcissism. On tomorrow, if you're with us for the first time, on tomorrow we actually are covering, it's Thinking Thursday, so we tend to talk religion, faith, philosophy, and right now we are on the history of pagan practices in Christianity. So if you have a desire and a hunger for that sort of knowledge, you can catch us on Thursday. On Friday, we cover health, wealth, and wisdom, and we cover food and what you're intaking in your body, origins of food, and we also talk business and finance on Fridays. So I try to cover something different every single day, just in case you just want to hang out with us one day of the week, or like some, you want to join us Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. Monday is inspiration. Tuesday is Black Table Talk. It's all things Black history, what's happening in Black news, what's going on with African Americans or American descendants of the enslaved, or hashtag ADOS. All right. So today, as I said, we're dealing with relationships, and we're going to get into this book here. It's called Everyday Narcissism. For those of you who love to screenshot, I don't mind. All right. Yes, I am. Well, I am a believer. I'll say that. So we're on the book Everyday Narcissism. And for those of you who are joining us on Facebook Live, we're also broadcasting at the same time on Periscope. So we've covered some myths that we have come to believe in our life. And now we're going to be talking about boundaries. Boundaries. Are you setting boundaries for your life? Most of us believe that we are body, soul, and spirit. We are body, we are soul, meaning our heart, our mind, and emotions, and will, and we are spirit. And most of us are used to setting boundaries for our body, right? We don't like people touching us without our permission. We don't like to go places that we don't feel like going, right? We don't like to bring this terrestrial body into a space that has, just as some people would say, negative vibes, or you get to a place and you don't feel good, right, about a particular place. So you immediately remove yourself, right? Because some of us have a strong gut instinct. Some of us feel that, hey, something is not right here. I don't know what it is, but I'm not feeling it. That's happened to me a couple times, and I have found myself leaving a space or leaving a place or deciding not to hang out with a group of friends. And then next thing you know, they call me and say, oh my God, something horrible just happened. And I was like, glad I'm not in it. So we have boundaries. We've learned sort of to set boundaries about our body, right? And some of us are still working on setting boundaries with our soul. Not letting our emotions control everything, all of our actions. But some of us, we tend to lag a little bit when it comes to setting boundaries for our spirit. For our spirit. So today we're going to talk about building boundaries. And the author gives us a quote from the movie The Land Before Time. And the quote is, "Let your heart guide you. It whispers, so listen closely." Well, the heart without Christ controlling it can lead us into some very interesting and very sometimes dangerous places. The scripture tells us that the heart without Christ leading is wicked. Who can know it? And so when someone says, let your heart guide you, I always add a caveat to that. Because if your heart is not led by the Holy Spirit, your heart can guide you into doing a whole bunch of things that are not good for you. The writer says here, who we are is made up of our likes, our dislikes, our wants, our needs, our feelings, our values, our beliefs, our experiences, and spirituality. These comprise our personal boundaries and our truths. The myths of everyday narcissism tells us that these truths are not important. Instead, we are encouraged to live by others' truths because those are supposedly more important than our own. As we grow up and we begin to live according to the myths of others, we lose sight of who we are. Instead, we focus on taking care of others and being responsible for them. When we do this, we become boundaryless. Because as I was sharing in a conversation with a sister recently, yes, there is a place in us, right, where we feel a responsibility to the people that are around us. We feel a responsibility to mankind, humankind. But that responsibility should not override the responsibility that you have to yourself and the responsibility you have with your Creator. The scriptures gives us a specific directive. He says, love the Lord your God, priority, with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, with all your strength. That's priority. And then he says, love your neighbor. And then here's the caveat that a lot of people miss. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. So I cannot do a very good job of loving my neighbor if I have not done a very good job of loving myself. Right? How I treat my neighbor is only going to be in relative response to how I have treated myself. And if I'm dysfunctional, I'm going to treat my neighbor better than I treat myself, when that's not what scripture tells us. He says, love your neighbor as you love yourself, not love your neighbor better than you love yourself. So we have to get that in order, in balance, and in proper priority. All right. I'll just be honest. African American women, most people in the world recognize that we are loving everyone else better than we love ourselves. I might get in trouble with that statement, but the reality is we spend a lot of time nurturing and caring and loving on others better than we do ourselves many times. And we start to see it in our health, right? We start to see it in stressors. We start to see it in a lot of different things. We know that because we are in America, many times the Black woman has become what some would phrase the beast of burden for the workload. Not necessarily because she wanted to or because she chose it, but because of societal factors many times that has played into it. And so now we are at a point in history where we're starting to see Black women begin to reclaim their time. All right. We're starting to see African American women realize, hey, I can't be every woman if I'm not a whole woman for myself. I can only be as good for my family as I am taking care of my soul and my health. So yes, you are seeing an increase of women exercise groups, women having, doing therapeutic things for themselves and going on retreats. It's time for us, to take better care of ourselves so that we can be more productive. All right. We do not want to be hugely successful in the world, and yet our own bodies, our own souls, our own spirits are falling apart. So if you have an African American woman, significant partner, mother, sister, niece, please encourage them to put their life in proper perspective and make sure they're doing what they need to do to replenish their soul, their body, their spirit, so that they could be whole within themselves and also better for the world at large. So she says that when we focus on taking care of everything else to the exclusion of ourselves, we become boundaryless. We conform ourselves to what others ask and expect of us. We change who we appear to be. much like a chameleon, to fit in and be accepted. When we don't express who we truly are through our actions or words, we fail to declare ourselves. We don't express our boundaries, our identity, our truth, either to others or to ourselves. When we eat food that we dislike, when we have sexual activity when we don't want to, or when we outwardly agree to something that doesn't inwardly agree with us, we have violated our own boundary. We have not honored ourselves. Some of us partly honor ourselves and then we stop and freeze. We say what we want and what is important to us. However, we don't actually do anything about it. We may complain about not getting what we want or need, yet we don't seriously attempt to fulfill that need or desire. We wait for the other person to change or to give us what we want. We don't take the risk of acting or changing ourselves. Think about this. Each time we don't honor our own boundaries, and each time others don't honor who we are, an old wound within us is deepened. Over time, when we repeatedly fail to honor ourselves, many of us no longer know who we are. We lose respect for ourselves because we get into a flow of just doing what people want us to do, which is in fact a form of dishonor for your own life and your own self. We become so focused on others' desires that we don't know our own truth or trust the wisdom that God has already imparted to us or live by our own values. Oftentimes when I'm doing private coaching sessions, I try to get people to ask yourself, what is it that you truly value? What is it that you truly want? And don't just think about it in the generic sense. Literally, go down the line. What is it that you value in your spiritual life? What is it that you value when it comes to your body, your personal space? What is it that you value when it comes to your intellect, your mind? What do you want to learn? What do you want to grow in? Your professional life, what is it that you value? Do you value money? Do you value your position? Do you value promotion? Do you value having a team of people to work with? What is it that you value? What is it that you value in your spiritual life? Do you value freedom to hear from God? Do you value close-knit relationships with people who are of like mind? Do you value having a spiritual leader? What is it that you value? Because if you don't know what you value, anybody can come along and move the boundaries. When we don't set our own boundaries, we dishonor ourselves. Yet at the same time, a part of us remains in touch with our own truth. This innate wisdom leads to anger when we are not respected either by others or ourselves. Sometimes we can get extremely mad at our own selves because we know that there are things that we believe. And when we allow ourselves to be just carried along by somebody else's values, it can cause you to get angry at yourself. You start talking to yourself and saying, now, Shantae, you know better than this. Why are you allowing them to pull you in this direction? You have a value in your life of peace. But somebody wants to drag you into their drama today. You know better than that. Being dragged into somebody else's drama devalues who you are. It devalues your own personal boundaries. It dishonors who you are. So when we find ourselves doing something that dishonors us, it can cause us to be mad, not just at other people, but also angry or mad with ourselves. So what are we going to do about it? If you're mad with yourself today, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to change? Each time we don't honor our own boundaries, and each time others don't honor who we are, an old wound is deepened. As a result, anger and hurt get stored on the inside of us. As children, many of us keep this anger and hurt to ourselves. To our young minds, expressing those feelings would result in rejection. And sometimes in an African American household, expressing those things will result in a whooping or a spanking or a beating, or whichever one of those three words that you want to use, but it's all the same thing. And often we would be right. We do this over and over in our young childhood until we come to believe we don't even have a right to feel angry or hurt. There are some people that if you get upset or you get mad around them or you get angry around them, they automatically want you to press that down. They want to suppress it. When the Word of God tells us to be angry, but sin not, which means it's possible to be angry and not be in sin. But don't stay there, because the longer you stay there, you are susceptible to do something that will cause you to sin. So you can be angry. Yeah. Be angry and sin not. So let's take a look at one particular case study. It's called Ruth and Hal. Ruth and Hal. By the time Ruth turns 15, she has learned from her parents, her grandparents, her teachers, and most other adults that she has the power and the responsibility to make everyone else happy. This is a myth. Ruth is in 9th grade. Her parents and teachers are proud of her. She studies hard, she earns high grades, and she is active in her synagogue. She is not particularly interested in school or Judaism. However, she knows how to please the adults in her life. What Ruth loves to do for herself is draw and paint, and she is grateful that her relatives and teachers consider this an acceptable activity. One day, Hal, a boy from the neighborhood, asks her out to a movie. She doesn't know him very well. Her parents and his parents are friends, though, so she says yes. Ruth enjoys the movie. However, she finds Hal selfish and boring. As he drives her home after the film, he talks about himself in great detail and does not ask her any questions about herself or her life. After he parks the car near her home, he tries to kiss her. She says no and turns her head away. He says, "Oh, come on," takes her head in his hands and plants a firm kiss on her mouth. She pushes him away. "I said no." She attempts to set a clear, firm boundary. Not respecting that boundary, Hal leans toward her and says, "Don't be so cold. I like you. You don't want to hurt my feelings, do you?" This confuses Ruth. She believes she has a right to say no. And suddenly, all those myths that has been built into her through childhood come flooding into her mind. She wants to be liked and accepted by Hal, by his parents, and by people in general. She's afraid that he won't like her if she keeps holding him off, even if she doesn't like him that much. In her fear, she disregards her own boundaries. So she gives in to his kisses, and she and Hal make out in the car for several minutes. Later, alone in her bedroom, Ruth feels sad, confused, and bewildered, and disappointed in herself. She doesn't understand why she just spent 5 minutes kissing a boy she doesn't like. Now, there are unfortunately lots of Ruths out here, and they're not 15. Some of us don't understand why we spent the time we spent kissing the things that we didn't like. Didn't have to be a boy. All right? Kissing that thing you don't like could be a job. Kissing that thing you don't like could be a place where you are attending. Kissing that thing you don't like could be an event that you attend every year and you don't even like it, but you go. You go because other people are going. You go because all your friends are going, but you have absolutely no interest in it. And you think you're doing your friends a favor by going, but what you're actually doing is you're dishonoring your own boundaries. Something within you is afraid to say no. Something within you is afraid to say, I don't feel like it. Something within you is afraid to rock the boat or cause some sort of conflict because you're not willing to go along with whatever it is. Something within you is afraid to say, I think I want to try something new when you may be attending a family church and all of your family goes there. And it may be uncomfortable to say, I want to branch out and go somewhere else because you know that you're going to get pushback from all of your family members. They're going to give you the, we've been in this church for 50, 11, 100 million, 1,000 years. And why do you want to go somewhere else? And, you know, everything is going well. And what's the problem? And if you are hesitating, and you feel like you cannot say anything different than what is being said, you need to deal with it. You have to ask yourself, what is holding me back? Do I really want to be here? Or am I in here? Or am I doing this only to please someone else? So let's talk, as we close in this book today, let's talk about chronic passivity. Chronic passivity. One common variant of failing to honor our own boundaries is passivity. There are times in everyone's life when passiveness, being patient, waiting, and seeing, taking a step back, or letting someone else take the lead can be very wise. For some of us, though, everyday narcissism encourages us to make passiveness a way of life. We start letting everyone else set our goals for life, guide us, and tell us what to do. We rarely or never state what we want or need. We don't take responsibility for ourselves or our feelings. Passivity is like being a leaf in the river. It just flows with the current. That current may take the leaf down the rapids or slam up against the log or wash it up on a random beach. Whatever happens, though, we get to tell ourselves that we weren't the ones to blame and that what happened was done to us. That's the emotional payoff of passivity. You never have to take personal responsibility for what is happening and occurring in your life. Conflict avoidance is perhaps the most common form of passivity. For many of us, conflict is frightening. For some of us, conflict can be exhilarating, going towards a thing and facing it head on. As children, conflict may have usually resulted in feeling rejected, hurt, and alone. So we learned to avoid it as much as we could, often by keeping quiet. Yet conflict is unavoidable in our life. When we try to avoid conflict, we create a new conflict. This tension is not between us and another person. This tension becomes the thing that is within us. Then we become upset or angry about what may or may not happen. Because we keep this conflict inside ourselves, there is no risk of rejection because it's only you and your mind that's going at it. That's the payoff. Yet, if we regularly repeat this behavior, and if we are conflict avoidant, we probably will then over time collect anger and collect resentment. And that anger and resentment begins to build. And this often leads to depression. Furthermore, when we repeatedly avoid conflict, we tend to let other people take advantage of us. And then we turn around and get upset that other people have taken advantage of us. This only adds to our anger and resentment. Eventually, something inside of us will rebel. It can no longer tolerate not being counted, not having a voice, and not being listened to. We may suddenly blow our top and lash out, leaving everyone responding, "What happened to her or him?" Either we lash out at others or we get angry at ourselves for not speaking up. Then we punish ourselves, become depressed, or both. In short, when we choose conflict avoidance, we might manage to avoid the immediate discomfort. However, we usually create long-term misery. Yes. And as Priestley says on my Facebook page, yes, they take advantage of you and right to your face sometimes. When adults are chronically conflict avoidant, that form of passivity often began as a sensible adaptation to a childhood in which most conflicts led to them being harmed or rejected. They learned they were better off giving in than standing up for themselves. This happens a lot with people who were either physically abused in their childhood or they were sexually abused. This also happens with people who are bullied in childhood. They start giving in to avoid the conflict. And if they don't deal with that, if you don't deal with that pattern in childhood, it will bleed over into your adulthood. Paradoxically, some chronically avoidant adults were feisty children who did regularly stand up for themselves. However, their parents began to repeatedly punish or reject them for that feistiness, and they eventually surrendered. I just want to put a shout out there to my family, to my mother and my brothers and my siblings and my aunts and uncles who did not tamper down my feistiness. I thank you for that today because I'm still feisty. They let me be feisty too. They let me have arguments and they let me reason with them. My mom to a certain degree. At a certain point, she was like, "No, you're going to do what I say." But most of the adults, I can say, growing up, did not try to suppress my ability to speak out. And I think that's important. Other chronically avoidant adults were born with more passive natures. Many of those people struggled with asserting themselves even from a young age. Now they can rarely stand up for what they want or need, and they tend to cave in easily, get discouraged easily, and have little resilience. They have learned to take whatever life offers, the good and the bad, and they don't usually ask for or work for anything different. When faced with a conflict as adults, chronically passive people tend to get better and better at becoming silent and not making waves. Now, I don't have too many friends who are silent and don't make waves. Most of my friends speak out, and most of my friends make waves or are saying something controversial usually. Why? Because we tend to attract what is within us. All right? So if you find yourself in a circle of passive people, you have to ask yourself, am I as passive as everyone else around me? I know sometimes we don't want to examine our circle or we don't want to examine our sphere of influence. But if you are looking to become a less passive person, then you also need to look at who your circle of influence is. Are they very, very passive, or do you have a mix of people in your sphere of influence? Do you have some people who are relatively passive, and do you have some people who are on the other end of that spectrum, and they are often found speaking out? Whether this passivity is partly natural or 100% learned, two common everyday narcissism fears are behind it. There's a fear of becoming vulnerable and a fear of being rejected if they speak their truth or take a stand that might displease someone. Often there's another everyday narcissism lesson behind passivity. If we believe that other people are ultimately responsible for our happiness, then there is no need to advocate for ourselves because we're waiting on someone else to make us happy. We get to be irresponsible about creating our own happiness, and we get to blame others when we are feeling down or when things don't go our way. Yet, chronic passivity is never an adequate response to life. There are times when each of us needs to get a canoe and a paddle, put them into the river, and start paddling and steering in the direction we want our life to go. I'm going to come back to that statement. Passive people do get angry, of course. However, they usually don't express much of their anger outwardly. They just feel it silently, express it indirectly through pouting, through sideways comments or the side eye, or what we call today shade, through ignoring others or ghosting, through refusing to speak to people or the silent treatment, or by simply ghosting, going away, or leaving relationships with no answers, and so on. Next week, we're going to look at another case story, Lindsay and Philippe. We're going to talk about crisis points, and we're going to talk about honoring your truths. She said something here. There are times when each of us needs to get a canoe and paddle, put them into the river, and start paddling and steering in the direction we want our life to go. This is what we have seen many times in the African American community. This country has not really left us a choice of being passive. We have had to find a canoe and a paddle. Sometimes we have had to build the canoe and carve the paddle ourselves, and then put it in the water and start paddling. So that was Everyday Narcissism. This is the book cover. I encourage anyone who is looking at improving your internal self to check this book out. We are about, I would say, 30% in. Lead yourself first. That's where we're going next. Lead yourself first. Inspiring leadership through solitude. I hope that everybody is taking some moments of solitude for themselves. This is a series of stories based on leaders and things that leaders have done in leading themselves. We're going to look at part 1. Trying to get to it. And we're going to talk about analytical clarity. Dwight D. Eisenhower, 1944. He stated this: make big decisions in the calm. Make big decisions in the calm. The hardest earned kind of clarity is analytical clarity. Unlike intuitive clarity, which arises from mental quietude than from strenuous effort, Analytical clarity arises from rigorous syllogistic thought. At that kind of thinking, because of its difficulty and pace, it is best done, and perhaps only done, in solitude. The process is one of breaking down complexity to a single point of decision. The leader must first identify as clearly and precisely as they can the goal they seek to achieve or the problem they seek to solve. Sometimes that identification is easy, as for a judge who must decide whether the evidence at a trial was sufficient to support a defendant's conviction for a crime. Other times, as for one family member troubled by the behavior of another, specifically identifying the problem might begin the process of finding a solution. Typically, in situations calling for analytical clarity, the leader confronts a complex and often jumbled mass of information. They must begin to sort the information logically. For a corporate leader, for example, some data may pertain to changes in technology. Other data may pertain to competitors' products. Still, other data might pertain to generational preference among consumers. Then, having brought some logical order to the information itself, the leader then must develop from it a series of logical premises. Those premises typically begin with certain facts that are known or likely to exist. The premises then proceed to include rules or principles. The product, for example, must be produced for a certain cost, or it must be launched by a certain date, or a certain legal standard must be met, with which the leader's decision must comply. This stage of the process often reveals that some information, which at first might have seemed important, is only in fact immaterial. It does not affect compliance with a governing rule or principle, and thus cannot affect the decision either way. After this process of sorting and sifting information, the leader is left with a series of premises about facts, standards, and after which they are often confident. The harder question usually concerns how those facts and standards will intersect. Sometimes, if you need to use legal reasoning, the relevant facts are known. The real question is what exactly the governing standard is. But more often, some of the relevant facts remain unknown because the leader's information is fragmentary or the events have not occurred yet. In either instance, the object of the exercise is the same: identification of the key variables upon which the leader's decision depends. That variable, depending on which way it breaks down, is the one that determines whether the benefits of a leadership decision exceed the cost. Identification of a variable is what provides analytical clarity. What began as a mass of information is now a landscape of logical premises that lead to one critical point. As to more difficult leadership decisions, therefore, analytical clarity does not always allow the leader to know which decision is best, but it does allow the leader to focus clearly and specifically on the variables that will determine whether a decision is a success or a failure. The leader can then determine, sometimes based on the focus, other times based on gut instinct, which is to say intuition, which way he or she thinks the variable will break. And from that determination, the leader's decision follows. Dwight D. Eisenhower actually engaged in this process throughout World War II. That was most notably true in June 1944, when responsibility for the success or failure of D-Day rested on his shoulders alone. The critical variable out of all the massive complexity when facing him was simple. The variable for him was weather. Dwight Eisenhower was the most extroverted of leaders, perpetually upbeat with a wide grin. He was, by his own description, a born optimist. Always energetic, he became even more so around people, his hands and facial features continually animated, his pronouncements crisp and decisive. A reporter observed him walking up and down, pacing patterns on the rug, his flat, harsh voice ejecting idea after idea, like sparks flung from an emery wheel. But unlike Douglas MacArthur, under whom Eisenhower served for 7 years after the First World War, and who was a more negative example for Eisenhower than a positive one, he was not dictatorial. Instead, throughout his tenure as commander of Allied forces in North Africa and then in Europe, Eisenhower was humble, earnestly engaging the people around him, seeking compromise wherever he could. His sincerity was universally recognized. So was his reputation for fair dealing. The overall effect was to energize others as much as they energized him. Even his most prickly lieutenant, British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, wrote that Eisenhower drew, quote, the hearts of men towards him as a magnet draws the bits of metal. Montgomery wrote further in his diary shortly before D-Day, he has a generous and lovable character, and I would trust him to my last gasp. Yet, even Eisenhower, the most sociable of men, deliberately sought out solitude at the most critical junctures of his leadership. The practice reached back to the very outset of the war. Just 5 days after Pearl Harbor, then serving as a one-star general in San Antonio, Eisenhower received orders to report immediately to the War Department. He had no idea why he was summoned, but took the next plane to Washington. Upon arriving, Eisenhower was promptly ushered into a meeting alone with Army Chief of Staff George C. Marshall. Without any preamble, for the next 20 minutes, Marshall outlined the United States' position in the Pacific. The fleet in Pearl Harbor would be disabled for months. The Japanese had also bombed the Philippines, inflicting unknown but presumably severe damage upon the American aircraft there. The American garrison in the Philippines was tiny, and the Philippine ground forces inadequately trained, and the Japanese meant to overrun the islands as soon as possible. Then Marshall looked Eisenhower in the eye and abruptly asked, "What should our general line of action be?" Eisenhower hesitated for a moment. He had not even unpacked his bags yet, but he had the presence of mind not to answer off the cuff. He asked for a few hours to think about it, and Marshall agreed. Eisenhower then retreated to a vacant office to prepare the first of many memoranda distilling his thoughts during the war. As he sat there, Eisenhower wrote later, "A curious echo from the long ago came to my aid." He thought back to his time with General Fox Connor, his mentor during World War I, a man he had admired above all others. Connor had told Eisenhower again and again that another great war would come, and that when it did come, the man who could lead the American military was Marshall. He is close to being a genius. With Connor's description of Marshall in mind, Eisenhower resolved that my answer would be short, emphatic, and based on reasoning in which I honestly believed. In his memorandum entitled Steps to be Taken, Eisenhower asserted that even though the Filipino cause appeared hopeless, the United States should send an aircraft carrier from San Diego to Australia, build up a strong base of supply there, and make every effort to save the Philippines. The problem, as Eisenhower saw it, was not strictly military. His thoughts reflected the broader political perspective that would prove essential to his leadership throughout the war. Handing the memo to Marshall, Eisenhower said, "We must do everything for them that is humanly possible. The people of China, of the Philippines, of the Dutch East Indies will be watching us. They may excuse failure, but they will not excuse abandonment." Whoo, Lord. That's a preach word right there. Marshall quietly replied, "I agree with you. Do your best to save them." That proved to be the first of many analytical challenges that Eisenhower faced during the war. In 1942, Eisenhower confronted grave and to some extent insuperable logical problems as he coordinated from Washington relief efforts for the Philippines, and later as commander of Allied forces in North Africa in 1942 and in Italy in 1943, and above all as supreme commander of the Allied invasion of France in 1944. Eisenhower confronted leadership questions with the utmost complexity. Those challenges went far beyond engaging and defeating the enemy. They included the creation of a military force large and well-trained enough to confront the triumphant Germans, the maintenance of supply lines across seas patrolled by German submarines, and the process of coordination with America's British and, to a lesser extent, free French allies. These issues presented Eisenhower with a staggering amount of information to sort, synthesize, and then act upon. But then, before Eisenhower could act, before he could lead the legions of men beneath him, he had to achieve clarity in his own mind. And in that process, from Eisenhower's first meeting to the end of the war, solitude played an essential role. We're going to talk about his strategies that he used in solitude on next week. But two things that were said in this reading that I hope you all got. One, in order to critically analyze anything about your life, if you're given a whole bunch of choices and decisions to make, you have to sort it out. Then you have to synthesize it. You have to bring together the pieces that matter. And then you have to make a decision. You have to act upon it. That general told him, and that's probably going to stick with me for a while. People might excuse your failures, but they will not excuse your abandonment. I hope leaders heard that on today. Think about that in your own life. People may give you a break for failing, but they will remember what you abandoned. They will remember what you walked out on. They will remember what you let go of without any fight, any communication, any of that. People do remember what you abandoned. This has been another episode of Daring Dialogues, and I've been your host, Shantae Charles. I hope that I said something today that would encourage you, that would help you in your own decision-making process, that would help you go internal and think about the areas of your life where you may be operating in prioritizing everyone else while abandoning your responsibility to yourself in your own boundaries. Facebook Live, I want to thank you for your time. If you want to join us over and continue the conversation, we are over on Periscope. And Periscope will have a live audience response. I've left a link down there, so if you want to join us and listen in, feel free to come on over. Thank you again for your time and attention. Until tomorrow, Facebook Live. Bye now.